In 1893, there were pneumatic mail tubes running beneath 6 American cities. In 1897, there were 14 cities in the planning stages for expansion. In 1901, the United States Post Office Department announced a 10-year program to extend the tube networks to every major American population center: Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, St. Louis, Baltimore, and beyond. The engineering was proven. The cost per delivery was lower than horse-drawn mail wagons. The speed was not comparable. There was nothing wrong with the technology. In 1912, Congress canceled the entire federal pneumatic mail program. In 1918, the last major operating network, New York City's, was shut down. That is 25 years from 6 cities to cancellation. The official explanation, repeated in every published account of the pneumatic tube era, is that the program was too expensive to expand, and that the automobile made surface delivery more efficient. That explanation is in the congressional record. It is not in the engineering record, and it is directly contradicted by a cost analysis submitted to the House Committee on Post Offices and Post Roads in February of 1912, 3 months before the cancellation vote, by a postal engineer named Gilbert Preece Waddington, who had spent 11 years building and operating the New York tube network. That analysis showed, on a per-piece cost basis, that tube delivery in dense urban corridors was 31% cheaper than wagon delivery and 4 times faster. Congress canceled the program anyway. Waddington submitted a formal objection, in writing, to the Postmaster General. That objection was received. That objection was not answered. And 8 months after submitting it, Gilbert Preece Waddington resigned from federal service after 23 years, moved to Portland, Oregon, and never again worked in any field connected to mail delivery, pneumatic systems, or federal infrastructure. The official record of why Gilbert Waddington left federal service says voluntary resignation for personal reasons. What the official record does not say is what Waddington told 2 colleagues in the weeks before he left, specifically what he had discovered during his final months operating the New York network that had changed his understanding of what the system had been doing, beyond delivering mail since at least 1903. Waddington was not a man prone to speculation. He had a degree in mechanical engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, class of 1889. He had published 4 technical papers on pneumatic conveyance in the Transactions of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers between 1898 and 1907. He had testified before Congress twice, in 1904 and 1908, in support of tube system expansion, each time presenting documented performance data that the committee received and did not dispute. He was not an idealist or a reformer. He was an engineer who had built something that worked and who spent 23 years defending its operational record with numbers. When a man like that resigns without explanation and never works in his field again, the reason is not personal. The reason is that he learned something he could not unknow, and that staying would have required him to continue pretending he did not know it. Before we go further, if these buried investigations are the kind of history that keeps you coming back, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. Now, back to Gilbert Waddington and to what the pneumatic tube system was actually doing beneath American cities between 1897 and 1912. To understand the real reason the pneumatic tube program was canceled, we have to go back to what that program actually was, not the public-facing mail delivery function, which is all that has ever been written about it, but the infrastructure itself, which was considerably more capable than the official description suggests. The official history of pneumatic mail in the United States presents the tube system as a narrow, specialized technology, cylindrical carriers, roughly the size of a thick document roll, traveling through 6-inch iron tubes at speeds of 30 to 35 miles per hour, sufficient for mail parcels and nothing else. That description applies to the standard letter mail carriers used in the daily public postal operation. What it does not describe are the secondary tube gauges installed in at least 4 of the 6 original city networks. To understand what a secondary tube network means in practice, consider what was being built in these cities in the same decade. New York's elevated railways, its early subway planning work, and its water tunnel system were all underway simultaneously. The engineering workforce, the cast iron pipe supply chains, and the excavation contractors serving these projects were the same companies serving the Post Office Department's tube installations. Pneumatic infrastructure of a larger gauge, 14 inches rather than 6, required no fundamentally different materials or techniques. What it required was a decision to build it that was not described in the public scope of the project it accompanied. Philadelphia's system, the oldest in the country, built in 1893, included a parallel network of 14-inch tubes running along the same routes as the standard mail tubes. Those 14-inch tubes appear in the original construction plans filed with the Philadelphia Bureau of City Property, which are held in the Philadelphia City Archives. They are not described in any Post Office Department press release, annual report, or congressional testimony from the period of their installation. They are simply there, in the engineering drawings, labeled secondary conveyance, without further specification. A 14-inch pneumatic tube does not deliver a letter. It does not deliver a mail parcel. A 14-inch pneumatic tube at standard operating pressure can convey an object up to 12 inches in diameter and of substantial weight, by the engineering specifications of the period, up to 40 pounds. No mail operation of 1893 required a 40-pound capacity pressurized conveyance system running alongside a letter mail network under the streets of Philadelphia. The postal function did not require it. Something else required it. And the same secondary gauge network appears in the construction documents for the New York system, installed in 1897, in the Chicago system plans filed in 1899, and in the Baltimore system documentation from 1901. 4 cities, 4 parallel secondary tube networks, none described in any public record of the program. The man who designed all 4 secondary networks was a civil engineer named Arthur Dunmore Finch, who worked as a consulting contractor to the Post Office Department between 1893 and 1909. Finch's primary employment during this period was with the firm of Farnham and Birch, a civil engineering company based in Washington, D.C. that held contracts with both the Post Office Department and, separately, with the Office of the Supervising Architect of the Treasury Department. Finch appears in the Post Office Department's contractor records, which are in National Archives Record Group 28, as the supervising engineer for the secondary infrastructure component of all 4 city networks. His contract specifications for that work describe the secondary tubes as auxiliary utility conduits for departmental purposes. That phrase, departmental purposes, appears in all 4 contracts. It is not explained in any of them. What makes Finch's role significant is not just what his contracts say, but what they do not say. Standard Post Office Department contractor specifications of this period were detailed documents. They specified materials, gauges, installation depths, access point locations, and operational parameters with the precision that federal procurement required. Finch's contracts for the secondary network work are not detailed in these ways. They specify the route, the diameter, and the phrase departmental purposes. Nothing else. That level of vagueness in a federal construction contract of this scale, work running beneath the streets of 4 major American cities, was not standard. it was not accidental. A federal contract that does not describe what is being built was written that way because the writer did not want what was being built to be described. The Treasury Department's Office of the Supervising Architect, whose contractor relationship with Farnham and Birch ran concurrently with the postal work, does not appear in any published history of the pneumatic mail program. Its contracts with Farnham and Birch during the same period are held in National Archives Record Group 121. The scope of those contracts includes, in the 1898 through 1904 entries, a line item described as subsurface conveyance integration, federal facilities, with contract values running to several $100,000 across the 4 cities where the secondary tube networks were installed. The Post Office Department's own budget records for the same period do not account for that level of expenditure in those cities. The money came from somewhere else. The work was charged to someone else. And the infrastructure it paid for was described in the only public documentation it appears in as auxiliary utility conduits for departmental purposes. But here is what makes Gilbert Waddington's resignation different from an engineer leaving a job he disagreed with. In January of 1912, 2 months before he submitted his cost analysis to the House Committee, Waddington conducted a routine maintenance inspection of a section of the New York secondary tube network in Lower Manhattan. He was accompanied on that inspection by a junior engineer named Frederick Allard, who had joined the Post Office Department's tube operations staff in 1910 and who would later, in 1931, give a brief account of the January inspection to a colleague at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where Allard worked after leaving federal service. That account was recorded by the colleague, a machinist named Paul Sturker, in a personal notebook that Sturker's daughter donated to the Brooklyn Historical Society in 1978. The notebook is in the Brooklyn Historical Society collection under the Miscellaneous Personal Papers series, reference P 1978-07. Sturker's record of what Allard told him is 12 sentences. In those 12 sentences, Allard describes the January 1912 inspection as the first time Waddington had personally entered the secondary network infrastructure rather than supervising its maintenance from above. He describes Waddington emerging from the inspection access point after 40 minutes, longer than a standard pressure check required, and standing on the sidewalk for what Allard estimated was several minutes without speaking. Then Waddington told Allard to complete the access log for the inspection and to note only the standard pressure readings. He told him not to record anything else. Allard completed the log as Waddington had instructed. He said he did not know what Waddington had seen in the secondary conduit section below the intersection of Fulton and Nassau. He said Waddington never told him. He said that within 3 weeks of the inspection, Waddington had submitted his cost analysis to Congress, and within 8 months he was gone. The intersection of Fulton and Nassau in Lower Manhattan is the same intersection that appears in the first of the 12 anomalous blueprints filed before 1880, the 1868 commercial building filing that showed the circular sub-basement chamber connected to the surface by an 18-inch mechanical access shaft. The pneumatic secondary tube network in Lower Manhattan ran directly beneath that same block. Arthur Dunmore Finch's 1897 secondary network construction plans, cross-referenced against the 1868 building blueprint by coordinate, show the secondary tube passing within 14 feet of the position of that chamber. That is not a fact that appears in any document. It is a fact that emerges when 2 sets of archived engineering drawings are placed next to each other and read against a shared coordinate system. No published researcher has done this in a way that has entered the historical record. The coordinates are in both documents. The documents are in separate archives. The connection is available to anyone who looks. The United States Post Office Department has never adequately addressed the discrepancy between the public description of the pneumatic tube networks as letter mail delivery systems and the presence of 14-inch secondary infrastructure in 4 of those networks that appears in no public record of the program. It is never explained why Arthur Dunmore Finch's consulting contracts with the Office of the Supervising Architect of the Treasury Department ran concurrently with his post office work and described a scope of work, subsurface conveyance integration, federal facilities, that corresponds precisely to the secondary tube routes. It is never explained why Gilbert Waddington's cost analysis demonstrating the tube system's economic superiority over wagon delivery was received by Congress in February of 1912 and then entirely disregarded in the cancellation vote 3 months later. It is never explained why the secondary tube networks in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Baltimore were funded through Treasury Department contracts rather than Post Office Department appropriations, or why the budget documentation for those contracts is distributed across 2 separate record groups at the National Archives in a way that makes their connection visible only to a researcher who searches both simultaneously. Why would Congress cancel a technology that its own committee had received documented evidence was 31% cheaper than the alternative? Why would the supervising engineer who built and operated that technology for 23 years resign from federal service? 8 months after a maintenance inspection, he refused to document in full. Why would the construction records for the secondary tube network be distributed across the records of 2 separate federal departments, the Post Office and the Treasury, in a way that makes the complete picture visible only to someone who searches both archives simultaneously? These questions don't go away because the tubes were decommissioned and the networks were filled with gravel and concrete in the years following shutdown. The infrastructure was sealed, the documents were filed, and the documents are still there. In 1934, a crew doing emergency waterline repair beneath Lower Manhattan broke through a section of what they initially reported as an unknown pipe at a depth of 22 feet. The pipe had a 14-inch interior diameter. It was cast iron, of a gauge and construction consistent with the 1897 installation period. It was not on any active utility map. It was not on any decommissioned utility map maintained by the city's infrastructure registry, which by 1934 had been expanded specifically to document abandoned installations following the 1930 collapse of a section of uncharted sewer tunnel in Brooklyn. The Department of Water Supply, Gas and Electricity sent an inspector, a man named Bernard Tullis, who spent 2 hours in the excavation. He filed a report classifying the pipe as a decommissioned pneumatic mail conduit. That classification was accepted. The pipe was worked around, the water line was repaired, and the excavation was closed. Bernard Tullis's report is in the New York City Department of Environmental Protection archive under the designation Emergency Excavation Reports, Manhattan, 1930-1940. What the report describes as the reason for the 2-hour inspection, rather than the standard 30-minute identification check for a decommissioned utility, is a notation Tullis made without elaboration. The interior of the pipe, he wrote, appeared to have been modified from its original construction specifications. He did not describe the modification. He classified the pipe, closed the report, and it was not investigated further. A nearly identical encounter occurred in Philadelphia in 1941 when a tunnel crew extending a gas main beneath Market Street struck a 14-inch cast iron pipe at 31 feet, deeper than any section of the documented pneumatic mail network in that city. The crew supervisor's incident report, filed with the Philadelphia Gas Works and held in the Philadelphia City Archives, notes that the pipe's interior had been lined with a secondary material not consistent with standard pneumatic conveyance installation. The pipe was marked on the crew's working map as unknown legacy conduit, and the gas main was rerouted to avoid it. No structural investigation was ordered. The pipe is, by the coordinates in the supervisor's report, still there. Boston, 1938. A sub-basement renovation of a commercial building on Summer Street broke through a cast-iron pipe of 14-inch interior diameter running at an oblique angle through the building's foundation wall. The building's owner filed a standard discovery report with the Boston Department of Public Works. The department's response, attached to the report in the Boston City Archives, directed the owner to seal the penetration and note the pipe's presence in the building's title record. The pipe is noted in the title record. Its origin is listed as unknown. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern that runs beneath 3 major American cities and surfaces, each time it is disturbed, as something that the institution handling the report classifies, seals, and stops examining. The official history of American infrastructure tells us that pneumatic tube systems were an interesting experiment that proved too costly to sustain and were superseded by automotive delivery. What the documented record tells us is that the tube networks included infrastructure whose capacity, design, and funding source were never publicly explained, that the engineer who knew that infrastructure best left federal service after a single inspection he refused to fully document, and that the cancellation of the program was voted through by a Congress that had in its possession evidence that the official cost explanation was false. The documents that contain all of this are in federal and municipal archives in Washington, New York, and Philadelphia. They are accessible. They have simply never been read together by anyone with a reason to connect them. These records survive because government bureaucracies file everything in triplicate and archive it by category rather than by meaning. Subscribe and share this with someone who understands that the most important information in the public record is usually the information that is separated from its context by being stored in a different building. The tubes are gone. The paper is not. Next week, I am following the name Arthur Dunmore Finch forward from his Post Office Department and Treasury contracts. His firm, Farnham and Birch, held one further federal contract after the pneumatic program was canceled, a contract with a federal agency signed in 1913. I have that contract. The scope of work it describes uses the same language, subsurface conveyance integration, and names a city whose tube network the post office program never reached. The tubes were canceled. The work continued, under a different name, with a different budget line,